Hey everybody, how's it going? This is Nick, and we're here with the second episode of the Jagged Iron podcast. I'm here with my buddy Kyle Briere, top 100 in the world, brown belts in Ju-jitsu, and I'm just going to let him introduce himself here and kind of talk about what he does.
Hi guys, my name's Kyle. I've been training Brazilian Jiu-jitsu since my early 20s. I'm now in my early 30s. Been a strength coach for 6 years now, CSCS, and I went back a couple years ago to get my master's in exercise science, and currently full-time all I do is strength coach and teach Brazilian Jiu-jitsu in Nashua, New Hampshire.
What's your athletic background?
I played like recreational sports growing up. Played soccer, baseball, I think like swimming and stuff like that. Nothing too extravagant. As I got into middle school and high school was more, I stepped outside of the organized sports and was more just, snowboarding and skateboarding. That was my outlet.
Of course you were, as a 90s kid.
Yeah, that was more rad to do, to rip everywhere on a skateboard in the summer and then work at a ski town in the winter. So it was good. That's kind of like probably why I have a decent vertical. I was always jumping, and that was pretty much it. And then I found jiu-jitsu when I was in college. Did jiu-jitsu and some boxing and Muay Thai, and we met at a boxing gym. So I just kind of was a gym rat my whole life, always lifting. My dad was into typical bodybuilding type of material. So at a young age, that's what I was brought into.
How did you originally get into doing jiu-jitsu?
What happened was, it's a wild story. I used to work construction, and I got one of my best childhood friends, or first friend, called me up and needed a job for the summer and knew, I was always working. So I got him a job at the company, but I was still out at school, and he comes back and calls me, that week, and he goes, "Hey, I met a guy who he does stand up, and he says he knows jiu-jitsu. You want to try it?" He's like, "He lives right in your hometown." I was like, "All right, let's do it." So came back home, and we went to this guy's house that was just a laborer who worked with us, and he became one of our best friends by the end of summer. And he grew up boxing in Lowell, knew the wards. He used to work with Dickie Eklund, I guess. So he had some wild stories.
So he says.
Yeah, he had some wild stories from paving and working with those guys. But long story short is he had like this grappling DVD, but no one to like try jiu-jitsu with. So we'd slap in the DVD and practice some crappy arm bars and then try to roll. And by the end of summer, we had some mats, and they were all pieced together. They were like, we had some black ones and blue ones, so we called ourselves the Black and Blue Gym. And then I went out to school, and I looked up jiu-jitsu, and Marco Alvin, Team Link, was who popped up. So I called him, said I was coming by, for a class. And then I was walking to my car, and this kid in the complex is carrying a gi out. And I'm like, "No way." I'm like, "Hey, is that a jiu-jitsu gi?" I'd never seen one. And he's like, "Yeah." I'm like, "Where do you train?" He's like, "Oh, it's in this place." I'm like, "Is it with Marco Alvin?" He's like, "Yeah." I'm like, "Can I come?" And so I just friggin' got in a car and with these guys I didn't even know and went and trained jiu-jitsu. And like my first class was humbling. I learned a lot. And I just knew, I'm like, yeah, this is something that I really like and can get into. And then from there, it's been 10 years now. So
That story could have gone way different, you getting into a car with a bunch of guys who were really good at jiu-jitsu.
It happened. It seems to happen. I went to California 2 weeks ago. I showed up to my friend's gym, and they're like, "No, we're not training here. We're going to go to Checkmat, and it's like 20 minutes away." And I'm like, "All right, does anyone know the address?" And they did the same. "Just hop in with us." I'm like, "I've never met you, but sure, let's go. Let's go train some jiu-jitsu."
Let's party.
So you get to meet some great people in the sport, and it's always a good story for sure.
It's kind of known as like more of a laid back sport, anyways.
Yeah, I think so. The community in it's really cool, and I think you can train it however you want. You want to reach a high level competition, then you can't really do too much laid back training. You just like enjoy the art and like to learn the styles. Then yeah, you can kind of be a little more laid back and just kind of poke your way through the sport. But for competition, you got to train a lot.
How often are you traveling for competition?
It depends. So usually come into the summer. Excuse me. Usually coming into the summer is where you'll see more tournaments. There's sometimes like a dry area where you'd have to travel pretty far. So right now, like we got in 3 weeks, we got Boston, which is just an open, but then 2 weeks after that is a pro trial in Atlanta. So the pro trials count like the same as PANS. So you get more points the competitive year, and then we'll have like a month off, and it'll be the same thing, like 2 more tournaments back to back, and then a month off.
What's a PAN? Just so anyone who doesn't know.
So depending on the organization you compete for, there's the Pan Ams, which is just the Pan American Games. So there's different weights to different championships, you can call them. There's an Open, which is just a base level of points. Then there's a Pro and a Pan Ams, which you get, I think it's like 2 times the amount of points that the Open would give you. And then there's Worlds, which is like, the Olympics of Ju-jitsu.
Have you ever been to Worlds?
As a purple belt, I went to Worlds no-gi. Yeah, just missed the podium. It was wild. It's in this huge, it's in LA. It's like this huge...
The Worlds for Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu is in LA?
Yeah, it's like a whole week. It's a whole week tournament now.
Is it open grappling or just Jiu-Jitsu?
I mean, you can... for the no-gi style, I mean, wrestlers, everybody's in it. But I think if you're... It's a Jiu-Jitsu federation. It's a Jiu-Jitsu tournament. So I don't think if you were to not rely on your Jiu-Jitsu, you're probably going to be pretty shocked on who's going to beat you. But no, it's a cool tournament. It's in a big pyramid, and you get in, and I mean, there's just people everywhere in it. It's wild.
Yeah, it sounds like a good time. And what about lifting? When did you start getting into lifting?
I got into lifting young. Well, I don't know if you want to call it lifting. Like when you first learn to lift, you do a lot of curls.
Lots of curls. Lots of bench.
I don't think you really learn lifting till later. But no, my dad used to have a weight set in the basement. And so when I was we still have some pictures. When I was super young, they got me a Fisher-Price weight set. So then I had my weight set next to my dad's, so all these plastic dumbbells and stuff like that. And when he'd go downstairs and lift, I would go get on my bench and I would practice. I had like a little leg extension thing at the end of it. So I'd say I got in in my early ages. My parents were always skeptical of letting me lift, but then I'd say by the time 10 and up, I was consistently just doing something downstairs. And then it wasn't till I started, get into high school or middle school was when I started, grabbing programs from people or putting stuff together and actually training at a gym, and squatting and deadlifting and all that.
Where were you getting your programs out of?
Oh, man. A lot of them were pretty old school. My dad it was cool because my dad, he still has a lot of these old, lifting books from, the 50s and 60s and stuff. So sometimes they had just base programs, and for me at that age, it wasn't like I needed an advanced program. I just needed to go in and get reps. And so I would grab them there, and then I would write some, or sometimes I would grab a friend and get a written program. We'd split the cost of one and then just go do it. I knew so many people in the gym, so if they were doing something that I thought looked cool, they would pretty much just photocopy their program. So I just kind of do a bunch of stuff. sometimes you look up an Arnold Schwarzenegger program and think you can run it, but you're not on steroids. So after 2 hours of lifting, you just kind of crap out. But I would just grab anything. I would try anything. Even sometimes like a men's fitness, little quick like workout would come in and be like, I'll try that, and go.
It's funny how when you're kind of like in your younger, you're in your teenage years, like anything makes you stronger.
Yeah, oh yeah.
Just like whatever the fuck, like anything. A lot of those programs, I look back now at my journals and stuff, and it's just like, what was I even thinking doing this?
Oh, yeah. And now that you have a structured method, you're like, wow, if I had just started this, back then.
Was your dad big into, it sounds like he was big into lifting. Was he into, like, bodybuilding, or was he competing, or?
I wouldn't, no. He had, like, man, some of the pictures back in the day, he had, like, some big arms, upper body. Like my dad would do deadlift. I think it was more of like an 80s style lifting. Like they still did like deadlifts and squats, but then it was like, made sure he covered his bench press and his curls and his arm work, and like the accessory stuff.
Can never do too many curls.
No.
That's pretty much the first truth of weightlifting.
Yeah, curls times infinity.
How much you bench? I think it's the most obvious question to ask next.
So, well, for me at Jiu-Jitsu, I'm more concerned with my rate of force development. But if we cover the basics, I hit like 280 with chains. That's with the chains, but I know I can pop like a 265 bench on a consistent basis.
That's good.
My bench is pretty decent.
What's your squat and deadlift look like?
Squat, after the 2 knee surgeries I had younger, squat was always my nemesis.
What did you have knee surgery for?
I had, it was just meniscus. I had it repaired, then the repair failed, then they trimmed it out. It was a lot of that's a jiu-jitsu injury. It was a lot of bad training. I worked construction, then I'd hit the gym, then I'd go train jiu-jitsu. So I'm surprised I didn't have more surgeries, but my squat has gone up to about 350. I can comfortably hit that. My deadlift's been pretty good. I got I think the last pull I made was about 450. So, for 170 to 175 pounds, I'm not a power lifter, but I can, I think I can sling some.
Maybe you should be.
Yeah. Too slow for jiu-jitsu.
What do you now that you have the knee injuries? What are you kind of doing to stop that from happening?
Squatting.
Just more injury prevention type.
Yeah, you just got to make sure your mechanics are good. Some days the squats takes a little bit longer for me to prep up to and get loosened up. But I'll tell you, you got to train the compound movements. Just train them with good technique. Don't really worry about weight. Weight will come when it needs to, and for certain sports, outside of powerlifting, max strength is, it helps, but it's not a end-all be-all for athletics. So, I just think the important part is just, for me, I know my body feels better when I'm doing the big movements, squatting specifically. I don't think anything can beat, as far as for stressing an athlete and trying to push them to the next level. Back squat.
Back squat your go-to?
Back squat for a hormonal response. Back squat, we joke around in the gym. Back squat's free steroids. It's just how often you want to be under that bar.
Don't say the S word, because now your athletes are getting tested.
Yeah, it's true. If you look at the research, I've done some. I was a big deadlift guy. Back squat elicits a greater response hormonally and stress level wise than any other lift.
Really? I'm actually surprised by that.
Yeah, I was too. I did a little bit of, so then I put the research aside and started, you use yourself as a guinea pig, and even heart rate response for a deadlift versus a squat. I almost needed like a max effort deadlift to hit like a heart rate response of like an 80% squat. So if you're trying to get, and that's kind of like what high level athletics is just you have to stress them and they have to recover from stress instantly. We found that the back squat has been one of the better exercises to do so.
I think historically, a lot of times the front squat is more associated with athletics. Lighter loads, but more of a quad dominant squat. And kind of, I just have found that a lot of times athletes are more likely to use it, not necessarily that it's better.
Yeah, I think the front squat gets used a lot in athletics. For me, like I said, I work with a good football population. And you know what? Size counts. You know, I'm not going to say that you can't get bigger front squatting, but for some reason the back squat is it's a bigger movement in my opinion. I think front squats are badass, and I would use them. You know, we use them for our offensive line players because they need to be more upright and block. But for defensive players who are rushing, the back squat is, in my opinion, more specific to what they're going to encounter on the field. So yeah, they both get used, but you know, some athletes just have a hard time front squatting. Some have a hard time back squatting. So in that case, you might need to pick the exercise that works better. I just know that a majority of athletes you can put more weight on their back than you can on their front.
What kind of? Well, yeah, a lot of times with the front squat, the limiting factor is in the abs. So you can only keep yourself upright so much. Whereas with the back squat, I mean,
back squat allows for. I think the front squat there's a lot more technique because you know you got to maintain that vertical torso. Some people who don't have the ankle mobility or they could have abdominal issues. I think this front squat is a tough one, but when I look at a lot of athletics and so forth, there's not a lot of times where if you're coming out of a set position, that set position has torso lean. So I like the back squat, but I think what happens is in the back squat is you're only as good as your variability of training. So we may squat, for myself particularly, I may squat 3 days a week, but first day out of it is not the same way I'll back squat as the second day, and then by the end of the week I front squat.
Right.
So you still need to have those subtle variations that doesn't allow, because I mean a high bar back squat is much different than a low bar back squat. Then you can go mid-bar back squat. So right there's 3 different variations of a back squat.
Then you have your foot placement.
Yep, you didn't even mess with stance width. And you can create a lot of diversity in your training for back squats.
Then you can even if you start adding belt, wraps.
Yeah, you can bands, chains. You can go a lot of different ways with it. I find most of the guys who come in are trying to squat too wide. In in your application for powerlifting, then that's different. If I have a power lifter, that's much different. But for athletics, I try to push them. You should be squatting underneath your shoulders because that's where you're going to be. In some positions like linebackers and stuff, they have a wider position. But the squat, I find that the sumo works better for those guys.
Right.
But
a lot of times too, it comes down to at what point is there the point of diminishing return. So how long is it going to take you to learn how to properly do a low bar back squat with a high amount and get that mobility versus just being able to go in, use a high bar and do the work. If it's not going to contribute to your sport, then it isn't necessarily what you're going to want to do.
Yeah, you don't want to waste time learning movements that don't apply to you.
Right.
But I mean, we found that I think the biggest thing that happens is, don't get me wrong, I'm not a fan of shortening exercises or like range of motion, but I would say 90%, if not 100% of my athletic population, they squat to parallel or around there, because unless they're an Olympic weightlifter or a weightlifter who needs to squat ass to grass, then that's fine. But in the sport of football, or most of my sports, even some of the swimmers, they need 90 degrees of hip flexion or a little bit more. That's it. They got to be studs out of that area. So I think where some aspects are is we don't look to squat. Get your ass right around parallel, a little bit below, great. and then make sure you compensate with extra hamstring work. But for sport, that's what I think, because we squat, we'll do a narrow squat. It's a sport squat. It's a more narrow stance, and you squat right around parallel or give or take. So you're simulating a jump stance. And then when it gets heavier, we allow them to open it up a little bit, put the bar lower, handle that weight better, and that's it. And by the end of the week, front squat them.
Right.
But
I think a lot of times, too, you don't want to, at the end of the day, I mean, that 3 inches isn't going to make or break you. You know what I mean?
she said. No, I think you just have to look at it. You have to look at it on, is this lineman, do they need to be able to put their butt on the floor in a squat? And if they do so, is that beneficial to them in sport? Because if you have a guy who's putting his butt to the ground trying to block, he's going to get dumped over by the guy who's got his hips at 90 degrees. I mean, there's much more power at that level.
Right.
So I think that's the biggest thing is sometimes, I've had people come in and they're like, that's not a squat. I'm like, look, the kid's not putting a bar on his back in the middle of the field and being challenged on the depth of his squat. It's just, I think the biggest thing you need to remember is that if you squat to parallel, then you need to train your hamstrings. Make sure your hamstrings are strong because, ass to grass squat is more dominant on the hamstrings. So just compensate by doing deadlifts after squats, and you just got 2 really tough. That's a tough day for our athletes. Take a lot of stress. Our squat accessory is deadlift. So
I think a lot of times, especially with maybe just pure lifters as opposed to athletic lifters, is they forget that the goal is not necessarily to squat heavier; it's to be better at your sport.
Yeah.
Some of these, you have a 250-pound linebacker who is training 5 days a week in his sport. Maybe getting down below parallel is going to hurt him. So then don't fucking get down below parallel.
You just got to look at the sport. Watch the kid's position, and if at any point they're linebacker. We don't even use the squat with them when it's getting... I mean, we use it for a response, but we found that linebacker, we actually do a lot of like sumo RDL style, where we're keeping that shin super vertical because that's the position they need to be lightening out of. So, I mean, and someone else could have a completely different way of training a linebacker, and it could work. Because you just have to have a reason behind it. But yeah, that's a good point. I think too much, and even with the general population, we weren't raised to Olympic lift. Not in America. I'm not saying there can't be great Olympic lifters. There can be. But the average person does not have the mobility to squat that low. So, start them off right. And we always work our mobility, but we do it not under load. So squat to reach, squat to stand. We do all that stuff in between your sets so that you try to be able to squat better with more range of motion so that we don't have injuries. But as far as putting 500 pounds on a kid's back and having him squat, if he hits close to parallel, I'm fine. He's going to test fine.
On that, kind of in the same general thread, how do you feel about general conditioning versus sport-specific conditioning on the field? So a lot of times, with me personally, I find that athletes get enough conditioning work on the field. Just kind of want to see, so I'll normally focus more on their strengthening and their mobility. Is that something you found, or have you had do you have a different approach to that?
I mean, what works for you, as long as it works for you. I think everybody, it's like Ju-jitsu, you're never going to see the same style, out of everybody. I just look at it this way. In a general sense of conditioning, it depends on the athlete themselves. If you have a young athlete still playing multiple sports, then general conditioning is fine. You need to throw them through a variety of movements. You need to train the shoulder, you need to train the elbow, you need to train, you got to train everything, the torso, the hips, the knees, the foot. When they become a little more advanced, or they're getting close to their competitive season, then yeah, I switch things over. You know, a lot of, for our athletes, even in middle school age, we have general levels of conditioning. Most of it's aerobic base, you know, like they need to have a good aerobic base. As we progress forward out of that, a lot of our athletes for football aren't doing anything longer than like 10 seconds on. You know, it depends on the what we're trying to get for a result that day, but it could be 10 seconds off, it could be or 10 seconds on, a minute off. You know, it depends what we're working, whether you want speed, whether you want lactic, and so forth. But you have to adjust what you're trying to do, because there's not a lot of times where in football the play is going to go lactic.
Right.
So you don't, you know, these kids need to be able to have an aerobic base to play for 2 hours, you know, because by the time they get there and leave and intermission and all that, they need the base to do that. But then you got to look at it. It's 10 seconds on, if that, each play. And then they get like 45 seconds on. You know, like there's, depending on what happens. So I think the most important thing is look at the training age of the individual. If they're a 12-year-old who's only played soccer, well, now they're going to need a little bit more general, you know, training. They need to expand upon those moves besides what they learned in soccer. If you have a 12-year-old who's played soccer, baseball, football, lacrosse, you know, like the kid's played everything, he's probably pretty good general prep. You could just then come in and work general prep and then make sure he's specifically conditioned for lacrosse season coming up. So that's kind of how I look at it. I base a lot of what we'll do off of training residuals. So like if you're training for a marathon and you can run, you know, 30 miles at a clip,
which I cannot.
Yeah, you cannot. But the interesting part about endurance is that ability has like a 25 to 30 day carryover. So you get your body up to that level of ability and stop running. There's no reason why 25 days later you can't do that. Psychologically now, it might be more challenging. But physiologically, there's no science behind why you shouldn't be able to do that, you know, 25 days later. You know, so you can look at these abilities, you know, aerobic, max strength, speed, lactic threshold, all that stuff, and you can now taper an athlete depending on training residuals. So that's pretty much what I use. It's a block periodization concept. It takes the guesswork out.
Is that 25 days you talked about? Is that just for the aerobic, or is that overall for the body in general?
No, so depending on the ability, if it's aerobic endurance, you can peak the body at a certain day, and then 25 to 30 days later, that ability is still there. It won't have that residual will maintain for that window. After 25 days, you might start to see a drop off from 30 miles to 29, and then a few days later, it might drop another mile. So this is how you can either continuously peak in a year, and how you can monitor base level abilities and track them and make sure that they just stay at a consistent level. You know, as much as people, you know, max strength is another one that's in the same category. If I run a max strength program and get my numbers way up, and then I don't lift heavy for 25 days, I should still be able to go in and sling those weights again. That ability did not lose. It's psychologically, I think it's a little harder, but those abilities maintain for that duration.
What I really think is interesting about that is I think especially with athletes, sometimes it's hard to get them to take some fucking time off and just heal and recover.
Yeah.
You know, I try to schedule in deload weeks every...
Nobody does deloads anymore. It's tough. It's tough to get them to do it.
Well, what I've found is that what I do is on those deload weeks, we now have a deload program.
Yeah,
so
yeah.
like where I program in, like, this is your mobility you're doing for that day, this is your stretching, this is the amount of time you're sleeping, and that way it still gives them something to focus on and they can still hit what they want to do, and I've found that works really well for me.
Yeah.
But it's like almost, before that it was like impossible. Motherfuckers wouldn't stop moving.
I mean, it's part of it because there are some kids who go from wrestling to this, to that, to this. You're going to have a hard time, which is why you have to incorporate those. I mean, that's just your GPP. You know, like that. You have to time those points in. You need to make it fun for them so they don't feel as though that they're letting abilities drop off. We have the same program. I call it my 1x20 phase. I didn't invent it. Michael Yasis did. But essentially you do an exercise for every joint and every range of motion. And that's it. That's the off-season program. One set of 20 for external rotation, one set of 20 for internal rotation, one set of 20 for bicep curls, then tricep extensions. So you want to incorporate those programs that allow your athlete to rebalance and make sure that they can weather the next season and not just get through this off season and train like an animal, and next thing you know, a month into the season, good catch, a month into the season they have a tweaked groin. You know, those little things are nagging injuries that you have to address, and having those programs set up make it easy because you just tell them. You know, I do it with my guys after the football season. They'll come in and they'll tell me they've been doing endurance work, and when you hand them a list of exercises to do one set of 20, they look at you like you're on crack. You know, bench press 1x20. What should I even start with? And they'll crap out. What's interesting, even at college level, they'll start first day they do it. They can't even get over like 15 reps on like the main lifts. But then the next day they do it, they hit it. And by the third time they do it, they adapt quickly. So it's good to have those programs in, and yeah, you need to make sure you make your athletes. You'll get some of your biggest gains from when you did nothing.
If you had someone who maybe was coming in, let's say a high school athlete who is a freshman and trying to get on the football team, has no real background in strength, at what point, so obviously, would you start them with a more of a general GPP, which is general physical preparedness? Would you start them more with that kind of program, or would you go right into the sport specific?
It depends on the athlete, because if you just go right into sport specific, but the kid can't even do a side lunge with good form, you know, he's not ready for any sport specific stuff. So you're going to have to look. I think a lot of it is the training age of the athlete and experience of the athlete. Now, some, you know, if he's never played any sport and now just decided to pick one up, well, he's got to be a pretty good natural athlete to then do well with that right off the bat. There's no reason why the proper training can't get them where they need to be, but it's hard to just say go into special. It'd be like someone coming to you and saying, you know, all right, I want to power lift, and they can't even do a basic hip hinge, and you have to just show them a traditional deadlift. It's going to be difficult, you know. So I think you want to just make sure the base is good. Make sure they can lunge properly. Make sure they can squat properly. And I don't even mean in those instances they don't have to back squat. They can goblet squat. They can do split squat. You know, you can give them variations. And I think that's what you need. You need to make sure the athlete can do, a Bulgarian split squat. They can do this. So now they're diverse, so that when you go into specialized training methods, their body isn't going, oh my God, I don't even know how to do this. They're going, oh, all right, I get this. I can do this. This is okay, and I can see why it's going to make me a better athlete on the field. So it's going to depend on the athlete. You know, you do need to move them over into a specialized program to get them ready, but I think if they have a good base, they can do well.
More for the general population, what would you suggest kind of starting off with is there any program you would recommend to kind of start off somebody in the strength? Like a lot of times I'll recommend Strong Lifts 5x5 for people to start off with. Is there anything you've seen in the past or that you would start off people?
The interesting part of the 5x5 is I start people off with higher volume, much higher. Actually, it's less than the 5x5. The reason, so the 5x5, if you got, it's a pretty standard for like strength, but the rationale behind it was just, it's not, if you watch a lecture by Michael Yassise, he breaks down how the 5x5 was created. And it's funny because when that was like a general standard, like, all right, I'm just going to squat today, strength, 5x5. There's no rationale really behind it. It works though, it still works, but I think with general population is I do the same way that I would prepare my athletes. It starts first with an aerobic base or strength endurance. So this is how I see things in my gym. If I give you're learning the back squat, and you do 5 squats, and then you rest, and you do 5 squats, and you rest, and you do a 5x5. You work 5 squats at a time, and you've probably seen it. First squat, yeah. Second, a little bit better. Maybe the third was just an off one, and by the last rep or second to last rep, they got 1 to 2 decent ones in there. So if you look at the quality for the volume, they might get 10 or less reps in that were good at a 5x5 weight. Because most of the time, I mean, usually you're training in that 80 percentile range for a 5x5. So the other way to look at it, and again, it goes back to Yassise's style, you give them a 1x20. It's 5 less reps. But when you make someone do 20 squats back to back to back, those first 5 may look a little hairy, but it's weird how all of a sudden it'll groove. The other thing that's nice about that is you don't have to worry about them overweighting it. At first, when people come in new, sometimes they're very set on, I want to increase my weight by 100 pounds every week. I see it with the younger kids sometimes too. The 1x20 program, it's really good. To do 20 squats at a good weight, between 50 and 80% of your 1 rep max, that's work. And that method's been around since there's a book, Super Squats, that talks about gaining mass doing 1x20s. You really do develop technique quicker when you have to do 20 reps. So I just look at it that way. For newer people, do volume, a lot of volume per set. When you break up the sets and distribute the volume over the sets, that's good if you're a more advanced lifter and you can get 5 good squats out of 5. But putting a lot of volume in on one set pretty much doesn't give them the opportunity. They can't overload it. They have to get good form with it, or else they're not going to get all 20 reps.
On that kind of thread, it's you got to remember that all of the things that we do are natural movements.
Yeah.
So squatting is something that we do naturally, or it should be something we do naturally, and your body's able to adapt and kind of figure it out for itself. Everybody's leverages are different. Everybody's,
yes.
Even if you lose 20 pounds, now most of your leverages are completely different. You have to pretty much, your body has to relearn how to squat. A lot of times, something as small as a bloat can make a huge difference in squatting.
Yeah.
At least on the high end, of athletics.
Everybody's gonna squat differently, and I think it is a basic pattern, but some people, there's two ways. There's natural squatters, and then there's natural deadlifters. That was the only way that as a kid you got to the ground or got something off the ground. So I've found that, those who can squat naturally sometimes have trouble with the hip hinge, and then vice versa. So you just have to make sure that, you train as safely as you can so that you can train again tomorrow and push it. That's the biggest thing.
Yeah, absolutely. Injury, a lot of times I think that people aren't able to reach their full potential because they have so many hiccups, because they tried so hard to push themselves too hard, and then they ended up getting injured.
Yeah, it's like
and then you got to start back at square one.
Yeah, it's like a drag car. You want to be a drag car. You want to go fast, but you need to make sure you can go fast today and tomorrow, because if you have to take 2 weeks off 3 weeks off, 4 weeks off, because you just never took the gas pedal off, and you're losing a lot of training time. You know, some of the better athletes we have were not studs when they came in. They've just put their head down, not missed a training day, and just 3 days a week for X amount of weeks just trained. And that's where that's key. You know, some guys are really good athletes and they know it, and they can just kind of come in, you know, before a competition, hit the gym for a couple weeks and go do fine. But that's only going to last so long. You know, where I've seen major differences in athletes coming from, you know, an average standpoint to then be able to be well above average is because the frequency, they train more.
Would you talk a little bit about balancing strength, power, and hypertrophy or hypertrophy, however you want to say it, for fighters?
Hypertrophy.
And athletes versus maybe the general population?
Yeah. Well, fighters are different. They have to make a weight class. So you have to be careful when you use hypertrophy meets. You don't want to bulk a kid up so much that he can't cut weight and so forth. But then on a catch-22 side is that...
Can I just say I'm super happy to hear you say hypertrophy, because half the time I talk to people and they say it hypertrophy and it drives me fucking crazy.
Well, it's like tomato. Maybe.
Exactly.
Well, the thing is, though, is that your strength, what I don't know if most people know this, but I read it, research shows it, you'll actually have longer strength residuals if you apply hypertrophy means prior to strength means. So essentially you're going to make the muscle a little bit larger in cross-sectional area, and then you're going to strengthen it, so your strength residuals last longer with a hypertrophy block preceding it.
So what you're saying is that the bigger muscles you have, the stronger you can be.
To a degree, yeah. Well, when you make the muscle a little bit bigger and then you strengthen it, so whether the nervous system is able to recruit that muscle better or so forth, it's just been shown that you do a quick hypertrophy block before a strength block, and then you come out of strength, your strength residual will last longer than if you skip the hypertrophy block. So in the case of some fighters, I do a short, even actually with some kids who don't need mass, myself included as a fighter or a jiu-jitsu guy, I'm not really a fighter.
I'm a lover, baby.
Yeah, you can do a short block of a week or two just to make sure that whatever gains you make are going to be even longer. So my goal isn't to be, gain 5 pounds of mass. My goal is to use it to make sure my strength residuals stay. So, that's all. You usually, So in order of things, I usually do hypertrophy, then I do strength, and then I finish with power. There's probably a million ways to put those three together, but make the muscle bigger, make it stronger, now make it produce force faster is kind of how I look at it.
Yeah, I think that's how most people kind of do it.
You could, I'm sure there's ways to.
Everything works.
You could probably break it down other ways, and you might see the same results, but that's how I would do it.
What do you think is the optimal body fat percentage for a fighter?
No, it depends, because there's different fighters. And there's also different metabolisms. Some people have a better fat metabolism, others have a better carbohydrate-based metabolism. So it depends on how they've evolved as an athlete. Some athletes feel better with a higher body percentage or body fat percentage on them when they go to compete. I know I've competed, middleweight, I've competed lightweight. Right now I'm like hovering between the two. I'm really light for a middleweight, and I'm like, do I want to make that next cut, of a few pounds to get to lightweight? But it's kind of how you're going to feel. You just got to get to your weight, see how it goes. If you don't like being that lean and you fight better with a little bit, like 5 pounds extra on you, then fight there. So I think, again, it's specific to the individual, but, in the sense of speed, the lighter you are, the faster you are. So if you need to be fast, drop the weight.
What do you think about cut? Like, there's some fighters, any really weight classed sport, so fighting, lifting, any of that. Obviously, a lot of times people focus so much on the weight cut, they'll lose 20, 30 pounds, in a very short amount of time, which can really affect their performance. How do you feel about, where do you draw the line on kind of weight cuts and doing them safely and properly?
It's individual again. I hate to fall back on that like every response, but I know for myself, as I've gotten older, it's a little harder to cut 10 pounds of water weight now. I can do it, and it's not a big deal, but I notice it's not the same as when I was 25. I think it depends where they react to the weight cut. Some athletes are talented at losing weight, and they can bounce back like that. So in that case, I would tell that athlete, go ahead and cut as much as you want that you feel you can do safely, get on that scale, and then bounce back. Other athletes don't bounce back well off of the weight cut. Sometimes that's the biggest trouble with fighters, is that they're in a weight class that they do well in, but the cut really fatigues them. It really doesn't allow them to be as good of a fighter as they can, because they can't recover from that stress. So I pretty much I do the same thing for all my jiu-jitsu students, for myself. Look, eat clean and work out. 3 weeks out, 2 weeks out, you'll figure your weight out. If I'm eating clean and I'm walking around every morning waking up at 170, then there's no reason why I can't drop the weight to go down to the 168s. If I'm eating clean and I feel good and training and I'm 175 and that's it, then it doesn't make sense to go cut 10 pounds and then try to fight right then and there. It's different for jiu-jitsu. You have to weigh in, shake hands, and fight. So you don't get a day to recover and so forth, and usually you don't have to cut as much weight. So I just, eat clean, train hard, your weight will go where it needs to go, and then, hey, if you got to fight up a class or you got to compete at a heavier weight, it's not going to be the worst for you if you're in good shape. If I'm in good shape and I'm the small guy with the big guys, then fine, go see how the small guy does. If you're the power lifter who's a little bit smaller, but you're in a heavier weight class, then, hell, go see how you do. It's not an end-all, be-all. So, to wrap it up, if you can cut weight and you can recover quick, do it. But it's not, sometimes I think the issue is that it's not a fight of who can cut more weight. It's still a fight. So you got to know where you can compete the best.
Personally, I had that problem. I used to try to compete. I tried to compete for so long at 152 in amateur boxing, as opposed to I should have been fighting at 165. And then when I finally made the switch, I did way better. So in my mind, it was always like you have to get the lighter you can be, the better you can be.
Yeah,
but that wasn't the case at all.
I was the same way. I did the lightweights, and then forever. That was how I competed up until purple belt. And then I got my brown, and I've competed middleweight and done fine. So I always recommend that to people. Eat clean, train hard, see where your weight's at.
For you, what's the difference look like for your off-season and your in-season training? Does jiu-jitsu really have an in-season and off-season, or is it just kind of...
It doesn't. You have to peak multiple times, so I know that coming up right now, I got to be able to peak like every 2 weeks,
That's what she said.
Yeah, right. So off-season wise, you just got to look at the residuals. Like, obviously for jiu-jitsu, if you're super strong, it does you good, right? But if you're so strong, you're too slow, and you're out of shape that you can't even get a hold of somebody to exploit your strengths, then it does you no good. So in the off-season, I do my max strength work. I get stronger, keep my conditioning levels, and go. As I get in season, it's all about rate of force development. I need to be able to put out force at an instant. So as it pretty much tapers in the lighter weight as I approach that tournament. It's all speed work.
Now, do you develop more force through weights, or do you do a lot more drilling?
Two different for technique improvement. Yeah, do drilling. I'm a big advocate of. It's hard because if you're too tired, your technique sucks. But if you're too fresh, then you might rely on strength when you train technique. So I try to train my technique when I'm tired and really focus on it, because then I can't use my strength and I have to rely 100% on my technique. So in the case of for Ju-jitsu, drilling is a little bit more, you're trying to replicate the competitive situation. So between drills, sparring, yeah. For rate of force development, I mean, it's all about what percent you train at, how you train at that, how you move the bar, and what plyometrics you're doing. I use a lot of the French contrast method, which is an old school way of how you used to train track athletes. It works, plain and simple. We'll take percentages based off of that. It's a good system. And then, Fred Hatfield back in the day. I don't know if have you ever heard of Dr. Squat?
Yes.
Yeah.
I think everybody's heard of Dr.
Hatfield,
Squat.
Dr. Squat. The most force that you can put out on that curve. Everyone looks at that curve, but it's not really a perfect curve. It's got like a curve in the middle. But you want to train at he found that at 78% you could put out the most amount of force. So we do that, but then when it comes down into speed work, I don't touch much over 30% of my 1 rep maxes, because you're just trying to elicit speed. You can't be fast under load. It's either you have a high force and a low velocity. You can have a high force and a high velocity, but then in order to train speed, it's actually a low force at a high velocity. So I think that's the biggest thing that for most athletes, it's hard to get into that notion of, well, aren't I supposed to lift heavy to be faster all the time? And no, it's not. And then there's other methods of oscillations and assisted stuff and all that works.
I've never actually worked with this, but I read about runners who use weighted, or runners who for a while people were doing weighted resistance on running to try and make you faster.
Yes.
Where actually they found is that runners who, instead of having them run flat with a weight, will have them run at a slight decline to kind of overload their system and force them to run faster. Have you ever heard of that?
We use it for. Yeah, I have. There's in a running pattern.
Just threw him a curveball. This was not on the
okay.
script at all.
No, that's fine. I'm terrible at reading scripts anyways. If you know your stuff, then it should just be a conversation. So look, if you're going to train runners, yeah, there's ways to increase their speed. So I think the biggest point that most people miss on this is that there's actually 2 different strides. And when I talk about strides, I'm not talking about foot strike patterns. Like, as far as I'm concerned, heel striking is an inefficient pattern and you don't know how to run. I don't care if you can run 100 miles heel striking. It's not as an efficient pattern as a mid-foot or forefoot strike. Research has shown that forefoot strikers move to mid-foot strikers move to rear foot strikers as they fatigue. So as their technique is tested, they move to a worse technique. So that being said, when you look at runners to get them faster, you have to look at, am I getting them faster at top end, or am I getting them faster acceleration? Those are 2 different ways of running. When you're accelerating, you're pushing through the ground, and you have that, the picture we all see. You're leaning forward, from heel to head is a straight line with the hips. You're launching the body forward. In that case, we use like towing to improve acceleration. Towing, resisted sprinting. You're trying to get them to stride out and be more powerful there. As far as for top end speed, that's when you use downhill running. It's a different strike. The torso is more vertical. It is not so much of a push straight into the ground as much of a paw. It's a pawing action at top speed. So you can simulate that to make a runner faster by having them run at a decline, having them do assisted sprinting. Because the rationale behind that is to get your top gear higher, you need to increase your stride frequency. You know, like you're at a certain distance per stride. You need to now be able to stride more in less time.
Right.
So those methods, yeah, we use them. As far as for endurance runners, most of that I look at as just ability to maintain technique and have the proper base level of conditioning.
We literally just lost everybody talking about
Probably.
running. No one cares about running.
Well, there's a whole I can go on and on about. We've made a lot of athletes faster, and some were pretty fast. You know, Kyle is a good example. He came in a 6-minute mile.
Not you, right?
Not me.
Do you refer to yourself in the third person?
I don't refer to myself in the third person sometimes. But he was a perfect instance. Young high school athlete, junior, 6-minute mile, heel striker. Heel strike, and he ran very crouched. Always had hip pain. We changed him to a midfoot and eventually to a forefoot. Kid cleaned up completely, no hip pain, got a lot stronger. His 6-minute mile went to a 5:30. And then, like I said, once we kept improving and then built upon, his level of strength and conditioning, he, 2 months ago hit a 4:50 mile. So it just goes to show you can shave some time off of these athletes, even though they're high-level athletes, and sometimes you're like, they're going to look at you like, I don't know how to run, dude. I'm about to go play college ball, or I play college ball. It's like, no, hey, look, you're going to shave time off of your 40 or off of this if you can improve your technique. So, I mean, that's just a big piece.
Right.
Big piece for running is technique. You'll have less injuries, a lot less injuries. You'll be faster. You'll be more efficient if you run the right way.
Do you think quickness in running, so running's that kind of overload and increasing run speed can bleed into other aspects of quickness and like maybe hand speed or full body speed?
Your hands have to move just as your feet. Your arms drive your legs drive your arms. You have the torso connecting the two. I know when I go into my speed work, as I approach the turn or a competition, mine involves more sprinting. Prior to that, I do more bike work because I can monitor RPMs and go, watts and all that. But that's a resisted piece. Sprinting is more applicable for me because I'm not, in other athletes, you're not actually on something and going through that resistance. The only resistance you have in sprinting is air resistance, and whatever frictions you occur, So I think it's important to look at that. For us, how we train our athletes, I use the bikes with, the fan bikes with the handles because I can get a similar response to sprinting. But then as we get approaching tournament and competitive, they're not riding a bike and the resistance isn't there. It should be more sprint based.
Right.
But yeah, that's a good point.
So back to fighting. If
people are still listening to us nerd out about this stuff still, we're in.
Yeah,
congratulations. I'm very impressed.
If you took a fighter and you could give them, just break it down to 3 exercises, kind of cut the fat out of their program and just break it down to 3 exercises, what would you have them do?
Well, for fighting, you need to make sure you have great single leg ability, but you need a lot of contralateral and ipsilateral work. You have to be able to throw that jab off the front foot, but then you have to be able to come through with a cross. So the hard part with single leg work is it doesn't elicit the same stress response as bilateral work. You can load a single leg a lot, but
you can't load it as much as you can
with twice as much. So the body's going to go under twice as much load per training session. So one of them, as far as for a hormone response and so forth, and again I'm biased, is going to be the back squat. You just need it for a stress response. The other 2 would probably be variations of contralateral single leg work. whether I do with my fighters, I do a lot of like, they'll do a step up on the right side to an overhead press on the left. So they get that feel of that pushing through one leg and pressing. It could switch to a banded exercise as we got closer to competition. But I've found with fighters, they're doing so much in that horizontal pressing plane that to get them to just press overhead actually helps with the shoulder health. So if we were far out, I would say, step ups with overhead presses, even some, lunge variations with band presses, I think is pretty solid for them. And obviously any type of throwing or jumping is something they need to use to stay explosive.
Right. And what about if you could just have a jiu-jitsu guy, if you could have him just practice 3 kind of the most important positions, what would you have him do?
Well, it depends
that's
on
like
what you're
probably
good at,
the
right?
most. That's probably the craziest. Again with the individual shit.
Jiu-jitsu is so diverse and allowing everyone to kind of immerse themselves in it and paint their own picture of jiu-jitsu. I would just say you don't need to reinvent the wheel. Find what works. It's usually the basics. You don't need to go very advanced into things. There's plenty of basic, rooted elements of jiu-jitsu that get overlooked because it's cooler to roll and spin into this submission or into this sweep. It's not that those aren't effective modes, but for someone getting into it, I would say the same thing as strength work. Make sure your base can support your roof. The roof, or the top of it can be the spinning stuff. But if all you know is that and you have no base level, then you're going to be in trouble when it's outside of your specialty.
Sports are always won and lost kind of on the basics.
Yeah.
It's so rare for that Hail Mary or whatever to go and make it. I think 99% of the time, like the basics is always going to come.
Good technique, good form. You're going to have less injuries. Athletes will perform better at the end of a game. You just don't lose sight. Jiu-jitsu started with a guy getting put on his ass and learning how to fight off of his back. So sometimes the hardest part that I see is everyone is very concerned with, well, I need to know a takedown, I need to know this. And I think at a lower level it works, but at higher levels, jiu-jitsu was about, okay, there's this huge guy in front of me. Why would you try to double leg a guy twice your size? I'm not saying if you're good at double legs, fine. But in the essence of jiu-jitsu, it was about I pulled to fight on my back because I knew it was the best position for me to beat this guy, sweep them so that they're on their back. Now I'm on top. That's jiu-jitsu to me. So I think you want to make sure you stay true to your roots. It's not that you shouldn't know takedowns. They help. But stick to some basic patterns. Get those down, and then let those show you where you need to go next.
Right. Well, if someone scores a point for taking you down and you score 4 points on the ground, then you still won.
Yeah, if it was a wrestling tournament where you get, the purpose of it is takedowns, then I would say you need to train takedowns. But in jiu-jitsu, I think too much emphasis is placed on, I need to make a dominant takedown and finish right away. Like, it's hard to take a guy down when he's just going to pull guard way before you can even initiate anything. So you that to me is what the sport is.
Right.
Pull guard, make your position.
So you have your own facility in Nashua, New Hampshire?
Correct. Yes.
Can you tell us a little bit about it and what you do there? What you guys do there?
So we have we're located off Exit 4 in Nashua. Hopefully looking to get a new space. But we have about a 3,000 square foot weight room and then about a 5,000 square foot turf area separate from the weight room. So we have 50 yards of indoor turf. The turf is mostly used for our speed development, any agility work, sometimes, general conditioning. But our athletes can train in cleats on it, so even though it's off season, we can put them in cleats a few weeks before they're supposed to even go back for preseason, and they're all set. They've been in cleats for 2 weeks. It's nothing new, and so forth. We have, for the weight room, it's simple: squat racks, dumbbells, barbells. I would say we're heavy on a majority of lifting mixed with plyometrics, is what you can say. Pretty much is what we do. And then I have about 1,500 square feet of jiu-jitsu mats. So then we train jiu-jitsu. So it's kind of like a one-stop shop. A lot of the jiu-jitsu guys, I do their strength coaching and get ready for competitions. It's nice because the team can lift and then go train jiu-jitsu right after. So it's a good mix.
What's your guys' web address?
StrengthLabNH.com is right now, and we're keep on the lookout for our next big thing. We'll be rebranding and making some aggressive moves to push our product.
Well, talking to you has been fucking quite the rabbit hole. You're a super smart guy, so thank you very much for coming down, and hopefully we can have you again.
Cool. Thank you very much, guys, if you're still listening, and this was a blast.
Thanks, guys. Have a great day.